We spent this week together on the road of faith. We've looked at a lot of the stories in the Bible that take place on the road. We've thought and talked about what it means to welcome God and others. We spend time looking for hope in God in our everyday lives, and we've dived into what it means to be a beloved child of God. And I hope that your faith has grown this week as we've walked together. We have one more story to look at, and it's found in Acts 9, 1 through 19. And it's found right after the road story from yesterday. So let's listen together. Acts 9, 1 through 9. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogue in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you'll be told what to do." The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound but did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything. The calling story of Saul, who becomes Paul, is very different from my own. I didn't have a huge blinding light that showed up out of the middle of nowhere. I didn't lose my sight for 3 days. My calling didn't come with a name change or a transition from being a bounty hunter for Christians to an evangelist. I'm guessing your calling didn't either. We've all felt called to different things in our lives, and all of our callings, they come in a different format. You meet Saul in this story as a devout man who's out breathing threats against the disciples. These threats seem to come as naturally and as often to Saul as his breathing does. We can't control our breathing. It just happens. It's part of what makes us live. It's this deep hatred of the disciples comes from somewhere deep inside of Saul. It's part of who he is. It's part of what drives his actions. It isn't enough for Saul to just persecute the disciples in Jerusalem. He has to go further. He's even willing to get a special permission note from the high priest to take on his road trip of hate. This isn't a small road trip either. If we were to drive from Jerusalem to Damascus today, it would take us about 5 hours. That's a lot of effort driven by Saul's hate. And I think we need to ask ourselves why Paul has so much hate for the disciples. And I think his hate is rooted in the same place that all hate for others is. Saul has allowed his differences to outshine what he has in common with the disciples. For him, his whole understanding of them is that they believe differently, and therefore they must be totally different than him. He sees them with this lens of understanding, not really as the people that they are. He's lost the ability to see them as someone who's just like him. He's lost that personal touch with them. But let's get back to the road with Saul and his men. They make it almost all the way to Damascus when Jesus shows up. Jesus shows up in a sudden flashing light all around Saul, and it drops him to the ground. Then he hears the voice of Jesus. Now, I want us to take a close look at this conversation between Saul and Jesus. This is the very first conversation between them, and it seems really personal. It starts by Jesus calling Saul's name twice. Jesus knew who Saul was. There's power in hearing your name. I wonder how hearing Jesus call his name made Saul feel. Did it comfort him? Maybe it struck fear inside of him. Remember when you were a child and an adult caught you breaking a rule and they called your name with their parent voice? Like, "Felicia Maria Fox, what are you doing?" My parents' voice could strike fear in me when they needed to, but that same voice could call my name when I was hurt or lost, and I felt instant comfort. I don't know, but I like to think Jesus used his comforting voice with Saul that day. Saul was already down on the ground because of the great light. And Saul doesn't seem to respond with fear. His response, though, it does echo with respect. Jesus knows who Saul is, but Saul doesn't know who Jesus is yet. So Jesus responds to Saul's question by identifying himself and telling Saul to go into the city and to wait. Later in the text, we find out that Saul has to wait 3 days before he's healed. And during those 3 days, Saul, he doesn't eat or drink anything. He just waits, like the voice told him to do. There's a part of this story that we often overlook. Saul wasn't the only one on the road that day. We know that there are other men with Saul, and they experience in a totally different way. They don't see the light. They don't fall to the ground, but they do hear the voice, the sound, but they don't hear their names. This experience doesn't leave them blind, but it leaves them speechless. Remember, all call stories are different. Mine is different from Saul's. Saul's is different from the men on the road with him that day, and theirs is different than your own call story. They are all different because they're all personal to the people who experience them. Saul could hate easily because he couldn't see the disciples as individual people. He lost sight of their humanity. But God never loses sight of who we are and what makes us each special. We do not serve a cookie-cutter God. A God who interacts with us all the same without taking into account how different we are. I think that is a sign of how much God loves each of us. God loves us each so much that God shows up and calls each of us in a very personal way. Thank you for joining me this week on our daily walks, and I hope that these moments together have impacted your faith. Our last reflection question is this: what is God calling you personally to do? What is God calling you personally to do? As we walk along this road of faith, let's always be mindful to pause and to listen for God's calling in our own life. And may we find the courage to answer and to follow God on that road of faith.